60 Minutes Rewind.
While the White House has plenty to distract it this weekend, another matter has come up, one of quite simple justice. We'll get to the White House involvement in a moment. But the story, almost 4 decades old, revolves around this word, Mr. One word that irrevocably changed one man's life, more accurately, the absence of that word. Professor Preston King, formerly of Albany, Georgia, now of Lancaster University in England, has been in self-imposed exile for almost 40 years. If he does come home, this 63-year-old man would face a minimum of 1.5 years in jail for dodging the draft back in the late 50s. It was not as if the young Preston King refused to serve. He had dutifully registered with his draft board, but he stubbornly refused to report for duty if it would not address him with dignity. He insisted that it call him Mr.
I don't mind serving time in the Army, but I don't wish to be subject to both the injury and the insult. What I was saying was, here's a discriminatory pattern. It's quite clearly established. The board has acted in an arbitrary manner towards me.
In 1956, 20-year-old Preston King, a graduate of Fisk University, had been accepted by the London School of Economics for a master's degree. He wrote his draft board seeking a deferment. It wrote back addressing him as Mr. and granted the deferment. He then says he made a fateful mistake. He made a courtesy call to the board. It saw he was black. His request for more time to complete his doctorate was denied, in a letter addressing him simply as Preston. He wrote he would report for duty, but only if the Albany Draft Board addressed him as Mr.
In a system that's racially constructed, it's very important that the underclass not get above itself. And if it becomes too prominent, then it may be necessary to bring it down a notch or two. It was a question of rubbing something in, and the clerk to the board went out of her way in order to do this.
The draft board insisted on calling him by his first name. He stubbornly refused to respond. He was charged with draft dodging. The King family, led by his brother C.B., Georgia's first black lawyer, took up the fight. When he died, his wife Carol, Preston King's sister-in-law, continued to press the board to relent.
You have to understand that in the black community, dating back to slavery time, calling us by our first name is a sign of second-class status.
It was like calling a grown-up person boy.
That's right. In Preston's case, here he was being asked to become part of his country's military and to demonstrate first-class patriotism, and yet at the same time being addressed as a person with second-class status. And that's a contradiction.
The Kings are a remarkable family. Preston was the youngest of 7 sons of C.W. King, a dirt-poor farmer who put himself through the Tuskegee Institute by being the driver for Booker T. Washington. He got a degree in agronomy, became a teacher, then settled in Albany. He opened the first black newspaper there, a restaurant, 3 stores, and became president of the Voters League. And he founded the local chapter of the NAACP. He put all his sons through college. Your family, your life in Georgia, it was a pretty good life that you and your family and your brothers had.
No, that was good. That was good. That was the best part of my life. I remember my father, who left home when he was 14, and he made his way on his own. I remember him asking me when we were down in Florida at the beach. I would have been about 12. He asked me whether I was happy.
By the early 60s, Albany had become a focal point in the demand for civil rights. The King family was in the forefront. Preston's brother, C.B., co-founded the nonviolent Albany movement and represented black plaintiffs and defendants up and down the state. among them Martin Luther King. While his older brother, C.B., was facing the full fury of segregationists in Georgia, Preston King was in a kind of international limbo. He took teaching posts in Ghana, Kenya, and Australia, then back to Britain, where he settled in 1986 as a professor of political philosophy at Lancaster University.
Whatever that may be.
He was not covered by Jimmy Carter's Vietnam draft amnesty. He's been stripped of his U.S. citizenship and now holds an Australian passport. But this felon, during his exile, has written a dozen books and has, in a certain way, gone native.
But it's a very pleasant day today, don't you think?
Yes,
Well, that makes a difference.
A Georgia peach with an Oxford accent.
These years in Britain, he's taken on the mannerisms of the British. But I think that he would adapt as soon as he got down to Albany, Georgia, and met with his people. He would be home again.
One small irony of the whole affair is that while the draft board was pursuing Preston King, his father, C.W., was the commander of the American Legion post in Albany. He was a veteran of the First World War, and 3 of his sons had also served in the military. None of that affected Preston King's case. His demand that he be properly addressed was ignored.
From the start, I mean, of course, you can say that I was naive, and doubtless I was. I did not assume for a moment, actually, that the federal government would ever side with the local board on an issue of this kind. It never entered my mind. And so when I came home, I assumed that they would sort it out. I did assume that I would serve time in the Army, because everyone was meant to eventually.
At Christmas of 1960, Preston King came home for the holidays and was arrested, quickly tried for draft dodging, and sentenced to a 1.5 years in jail. While out on bail, he left the country. What happened at the trial?
At the trial, of course, the key actors were white. The judge was white, jury was white, the board was white. My reasons for refusing to obey this order presented to the jury. They file out, they file right back in, and when all the counts presented to them, they say guilty, guilty, guilty. That was another fact. They obviously hadn't even considered the material that was being put to them. And it was clear that it was an us and them thing.
Even the federal court judge who sentenced him, Wilbur Bootle, now aged 96, has had second thoughts. He said recently that racism was never so prominent as it was at that trial. Race was everything, he said. When you decided to leave, to, in effect, jump bail, why did you do that rather than go through the legal process?
Well, that seemed to me to be, in the circumstances, completely unreasonable. What I would have to do would be to surrender a number of years fighting a legal system, basically on my own, obviously supported by my family, but by nobody else.
Over the years, Preston King built a life for himself, got his doctorate, married, became the father of 2 children, Una and Slater.
Hey, that's fantastic.
Now Una takes up his cause, and she does have some clout. A trusted supporter of British Prime Minister Tony Blair, she was elected a member of Parliament in the last election. She wants to clear her father's name. Is he a stubborn man, your father?
Well, in some respects, yes. I don't think anyone who wasn't stubborn would have lasted 38 years as he has done. When it comes to a point of principle like that, yeah. And it was such a small thing in so many respects, but you had to understand the system then and the mechanisms then for keeping African Americans under control. I can't say to what extent they were determined to pinpoint him, because there's a whole other side to it, which is that he was the youngest of 7 brothers. They wanted to keep, they were very unhappy with the civil rights activities that the others were involved in. You know, there's no doubt that they were pleased to have this opportunity to get a member of the family and, you know, really try and prevent them or to threaten the others to stop. So perhaps they would have gone to any other lengths if he hadn't been stubborn enough to say, no, you will address me the same way you address a white person.
Last October, both the Albany City Council and the Dougherty County Commission passed resolutions calling for President Clinton to grant him an amnesty.
I hope and I pray that Preston will be able to come home again.
Will that be a big day for the Kings?
I hope it'll be a celebration for the entire community. I think that we'll see Preston's return as a sign of progress.
You want to see your nephews and your nieces. You want to see places again. You want to see how they've changed, etc. And if there was something that I had done that was evil, then I think if I were reasonable, I'd want to apologize for it and to make amends. In this case, I think the evil has been done to me. And I think it would be time for other people to do something to set that right.
What would be the first thing you do if you got in a plane today, straight to Albany?
The very first thing I'd do, of course, would be to visit the graves of my mother and father and my brothers. That would be the very first thing that I would do. Because that's a kind of connecting up, a tying up, which has been one of the most important things that I haven't been able to do. You know, it's as though you're looking at ghosts which haven't quite been laid. There's something unfinished there. There's something that's hanging out of the back of your head. And occasionally, you know, you turn over at night.
You feel that one day those ghosts can be laid to rest?
Yeah.
That day could be very soon. Last week, the White House began making inquiries about Preston King, and on Friday, the Justice Department announced it was re-examining the case.